General Mark Milley is a professional. He knows exactly what he's saying. And as you said, it's not like he's particularly candid with the press. This is the guy that stood beside Donald Trump when Donald Trump was like, can't we just shoot the protesters? And he was like, no. He's like, can't we just shoot them in the knees? And he was like, no. And they ended up putting tear gas on them and they went and did the Bible photo. When we think about fascism, we have to remember that there are so many signs that are actually happening. There's weaponized nationalism. There's scapegoating of minority groups. There's mythology of a better time back in the day when we were great. There is obviously the cult of the leader. There's the weaponization of the Justice Department, the cutting down of the free press, right? And now he's talking about locking up political enemies. He's talking about rounding up people and putting them in camps. These are all fascist behaviors. And the sooner we stop pretending that that isn't a word that could come to America, the better off we are, because this is a real fear that people should have. And if someone like General Mark Milley tells us that this is a real thing, then we need to listen.
I take Mark Milley seriously. I also take the other people that work for Trump seriously, and a lot of them would not be as dark on Trump. You know, someone like H.R. McMaster.
I mean, a lot of them would be, Coleman.
H.R. McMaster wouldn't call him.
What is it?
I think he's a populist. He's a populist with some very troubling anti-democratic tendencies, but he is not Hitler. He's not Mussolini.
He's talking about good genes and bad genes at this point.
If he were a fascist, he had the opportunity of a lifetime to show us that during COVID by declaring an emergency and doing whatever he wanted, and he didn't do that.
That was when he was still surrounded by people like General Mark Milley. He was still surrounded by people who could hold back his worst interests. The second version of Trump will not have any of those people.
I think you're right.
He will be absolutely surrounded by people that will say, sure, yes, let's shoot the protesters.
I want to know what the solution is, right? Like, so either he was the person who told us that he was going to have the best people in his cabinet and be surrounded by the best people, and now those best people are saying, yeah, he's a fascist. So was he hiring the wrong people and was not good at filling his cabinet, or was he good at filling his cabinet and the people who were the best people think he's a fascist?
That's a good
question. It's got to be one of the or the other, right?
I mean, it certainly.
Well, I would say look at the results. You had a strong economy, low unemployment, a secured border, no world raging at war. All the failures you have today, you didn't have under Donald Trump.
Mark,
Except we had
just to be clear, Mark, we're talking about Trump's character. We're talking about Trump's character in large part. What kind of leader he is. So I understand the economic case for Trump and all of that, but on the question of did he hire good people who then, after working with him, determined that they did not believe that he had the character to be president of the United States, or did he just mess up and hire a lot of bad people?
Well, but this is not a hypothetical. Donald Trump is not a hypothetical president. He was the president. You can go back and look at his record.
He was the president, and 40 out of 45 of his cabinet members will not support him. His vice president will not support him. His generals will not support him. He was the president. He was terrible. They're saying we worked as close as we possibly could to him, and we won't hire him again. Those of us in the regular world, those of us in regular America who didn't work right next to Donald Trump, we don't know. So we have to trust the people that worked as close as possible to him, and the people who worked as close as possible to him, 80–90% of them are saying, do not hire this man again. He is a danger.
I get it. You've got nothing to run on except fear of Donald Trump.
I have lots of things to run on if I was a Democrat. It's not just about fear. It's about saying this man is a danger, and the people who know him best say so. If you want to talk about what Kamala Harris is running on, that's a completely different conversation. But this man is an absolute danger. The people closest to him are saying
this
so.
man there have been 2 assassination attempts against this man because of this irresponsible rhetoric about someone being a danger. Can we stop it?
He is a danger.
Mark, wait a second.
This nonsense.
Hold on, Michael, because I had a feeling that you would say that, because that comes up every time someone talks about Trump and what he said he's going to do and what kind of president he might be. But here is Donald Trump just today talking about Kamala Harris.
My message today is very simple. No person who has inflicted the violence and terror that Kamala Harris has inflicted on this community can ever be allowed to become the president of the United States. We're not going to let it happen.
Is that irresponsible rhetoric?
No, he's talking about a policy issue. He is talking about her failures.
He has inflicted violence and terror.
He's at an immigration event talking about immigration. He's talking about her policies that have allowed all these violent gang members in.
Here's another example. Let's listen.
It's a choice between communism and freedom. This is communist, this is Marxist, this is fascist. This is a radical left Marxist, communist, fascist. She's a Marxist, she's a fascist. Comrade Kamala Harris. Comrade Kamala Harris. If Comrade Kamala Harris gets 4 more years, you will be living a full-blown banana republic ruled by an anarchy and a tyranny. They're scum. They're scum. And they want to take down our country. They are absolute garbage.
What about that?
Both sides use absolutely extreme rhetoric. I would argue that is the bread and butter of a political campaign. So let's not play the game where we try to pretend.
I'm absolutely exhausted by this.
No,
Both sides
I
do
don't
this
think
thing.
the question is.
This is
We're
insane.
diverging.
This is
they-
literally
no,
insane.
they
You have
literally
Kamala
both
Harris
call
up
each
there
other
saying,
fascists.
we can move forward. We can do better. We can have a joyful future. And this guy's saying people are scum and human garbage and immigrants are slitting your throat. And we're going to round up people and putting them in camps. And you're going, both sides.
No,
Well,
hold
let's
on.
say
That's
that
an
Coleman is right,
impossibility for me.
and
Hold on, let me
then
let Michael
that both sides are bad. Well, who breaks the tie? The people who worked closest with Donald Trump say, "Don't elect him president," and all of the people who worked with Kamala Harris or for Kamala Harris are supporting her.
Well, that's- I don't know if that's exactly true.
So the rhetoric doesn't concern me as much as what the people who know Donald Trump would say he will do and what we have seen that he has done. So I don't care about the crazy thing Donald Trump says because we kind of know that he is hyperbolic and kind of not smart. But the things that he has done, like that is the question that we are talking about, not what people say about him, but what people know about him.
And I think, but this is where, and I think from 2015 all the way through today, that's the mistake that people in Washington, D.C., the Acela Corridor, media, you name it, the people who count aren't the people who worked for him, aren't the people in Washington, D.C. It's the millions of Americans who will be the deciding
Well,
vote.
Donald Trump
They
has
will
never
be
won a
the
popular vote
They
in
will
any
be.
election
That's
in
not
the
how we elect
history.
our presidents, but that is the
But
the
you're
deciding
talking about
vote.
that's who
That's the
decides,
tie.
right? The American people
American
have
people
never.
No, technically the
A
Electoral
majority of
College
the American
decides.
never.
That is
of
decided
the
by the
American
people in
people have
these
never
votes.
It's
said
not. If
Donald
the
Trump
people
should be president.
decided,
Great, so
then,
be a
then the
threat to
people would
democracy and
say,
throw
I
out
know
the Electoral
Coleman.
College.
I know Coleman had something to say. I'm gonna
I
let you-
think that so often the rhetoric collapses into either he's a fascist or you think he's the greatest president since Abraham Lincoln. The truth is he's not a fascist. He's had plenty of time to prove that he has a fascist ideology. He doesn't. But he's also very flawed. And this is why it's a legitimate point that so many people that worked for him don't want to see him as president again. And that's not something I think you can easily dismiss.